Hello and welcome to the Adventure Toolkit example reel number 13. My name is Glenn Storm and I'm from Hot Iron Productions. Today we're going to look at the last of the tools from the Interaction folder, which is the Menu Manager. The Menu Manager tool is designed to provide menus to your users. It also holds simple information and it works with other managers, namely the Scene Manager and the Options Manager, to send your users to other scenes and to handle standard or custom options. Let's look at the properties on the Menu Manager. First is an array called buttons. These are the clickable areas of your menu, and I've defined 3 of them for this example. First, a button called Next Scene that will send us to another scene. Next, a button called Arrow White that toggles to say Arrow Blue, and it handles a custom option that will turn this arrow that we used in our Action Tools examples blue. The third button I've defined says Sound Effects On. It toggles to say Sound Effects Off, and it manages a standard option to toggle sound effects. Within each button's item, there is button label. This is the label you see on the button when the button is not pressed. Button alt label, the next property, is the label you see when the button is pressed. For next scene, I expect us to go to another scene and not see the menu at all. For arrow white, I actually want it to toggle between saying arrow white and arrow blue, so that's what I've done with button alt label in that case. The next property is button tooltip, and similar to the properties we have on our Adventure Toolkit, when you hover over them, you're given an opportunity to display text to the user to explain what that button will do, and in this case I've told the user next scene will jump to the next scene. The next property is button top. Here we're describing the position of the clickable area in vertical screen space. It's a ratio between 0 and 1, where 0 is the topmost edge and 1 is the bottommost edge, and I've set it to point 2 or about here. The next property is button left. This describes the position in horizontal screen space. Again, 0 to 1, where 0 is the leftmost edge and 1 is the rightmost edge. I've set it to point 1, so the top left corner is going to be about here. Button height and button width are the next 2 properties describing in screen space the size of the clickable area. I've described it to be 10% of vertical screen space high and 20% or 0.2 of the horizontal screen space wide. The next property is button pressed. This is the currently pressed state of your button as managed by your user. So if it is unchecked or unpressed, as it is here, you'll see the button label. If it is checked or pressed, then you will see the button alt label. The next property is conditional display. If this box is checked, this button is meant to only be displayed if another button is pressed. So let's imagine we have another button here called Options, Next Scene, Arrow White, Sound Effects On, and Options. And this Options button opens a sub-menu with more buttons. Well, then we would want those sub-buttons to only be displayed when Options is pressed. So we would click this box, and then we would define the Options button here in our next property, Display Button. This property is looking for an index of this button's array, and this is the button's array. The index are as follows. This first one, Next Scene, is element 0. Arrow White is element 1, Sound Effects On would be element 2, and our imaginary Options button would be element 3, so I would put 3 in this field here for those Options button submenu buttons. There is no such button, so I'll just erase that now. The next property is conditional enabled, and in that same example where we have a submenu, we typically want to disable the top level buttons while we're in that submenu. So here we're saying if this box is checked, we want this button to be disabled if another button is pressed. And in this case, Next Scene would be at that top level. We would say, yes, we want it to be only enabled if this button is not pressed. We would check this box and we would describe which buttons can disable Next Scene here in the next property, which is disable buttons. It is an array of buttons indexes, and there can be a number of buttons that can disable this one. Right now I can only think of one. That would be the Options button, and again its index would be 3. there is no such button, and I'm not going to confuse our tool by setting it that way, so I'm going to undo that. Okay, that's the buttons array. The next property is button font size. This is the font size of your button labels, and this property is here for your convenience. To set this quickly, it will override the font size as described in the button GUI style, which is our next property, button style. If you're unfamiliar with GUI styles as Unity defines them, I urge you to go to unity3d.com, check out their documentation, their manual, and search for GUI style. This tool happens to use a number of GUI styles, and as you can see, GUI styles have a lot of properties. Frankly, I don't have a lot of time to go over them, and they do look good on their own without doing anything to them. So I'm going to leave this mostly alone, and really all I want to do is color the button style so that our text color is white, so it shows up against our blue background. So I'll change it from its default black to white using our color tool. I'll leave the rest alone. Again, I'll refer you to unity3d.com's documentation on GUI style. The next property is another GUI style. As opposed to button style, this is the style of the button when it is enabled. Disabled button style, the next property, is the style of the button when it is disabled. Typically, disabled buttons are at least grayed out, so I've set our text color to gray here and left the rest alone. The next property is button press sound effects. This is an optional field you can populate with an audio clip that sounds like a button press sound effect. And like all of the tools we used in our audio tools examples, we have gotten this sound royalty-free from soundj.com. soundj.com. The next property is an array of text. These are items that can display read-only or input text. Right now I can only think of one item that I would want. It's a title, and I'll just title it menu. So I've got one item, and each item of your text array is as follows. First is default text. This is the text that is displayed by default. And if it's read-only, this is the only text that is displayed. The next property is modified text, and if this were input text, and then what would happen is it would be modified by your user, and the user's input would appear here. It is then passed on to the scene manager and can be read by your custom scripts. So let's say I had player 1 in this field, default text, and it could be changed by the user, and they could type in their own name. Their own name would appear here in modified text and passed on to the scene manager for read, as I say, by your custom scripts. The next property is read-only, and this checkbox is meant to signify whether this text item is read-only or not, and because this is a title and not input text, I have checked it from this example. The next property is text top. Again, this is describing the position of this item in screen space, where 0 is the top edge and 1 is the bottom edge. So I've set it to be quite close to the top at point 1. The next property is text left. Again, we're describing its position but in horizontal screen space, and I've set it to point 3, so the top left corner is going to be about here. The next two properties, text height and text width, describe the size of this text area, and you want to fill this in especially if you're doing input text, but because I am doing read-only text, and because it is text, I'm not worried about defining the size, because the very next property, text font size, will handle that for me in this case. Text font size manages the size of the font for read-only text, and I've set our title to be something quite large, like 60. The next property is text read-only style. This is the GUI style for the read-only text. And again, I'm going to leave it all blank because it looks good, except for the text color. I would like it to be white to match the rest of our menu. The next property is text input font size, and this is the font size of text input. If we had a text input, I would set this, but I don't, so I won't. The very next property is text input style. This is another GUI style simply for input text. The next property is tooltip top. This is describing the area in which tooltips from our buttons will appear. As I said, Buttons can have tooltips, and they will display in a particular tooltip area on your menu. I've defined this tooltip top to be close to the bottom at 0.75, so it's going to be down here. Tooltip left is the next property. It's describing the horizontal screen space position, so the top left corner of this tooltip area will be about here. Tooltip height and tooltip width describe the size of this tooltip area. I've described it to be quite short at 0.05 and to center on the screen at 0.4. The next property is tooltip font size. And again, this is a font size property for your convenience. It will override the next property, a GUI style for tooltips. I've left this at 0 because it will look pretty good at the size that I've defined with height and width, and I don't need to set it. The very next property is that GUI style for tooltips only, and again, all I really care about is that the text is white in this example. But you can do a lot of things with GUI styles, set the background of each item, etc., and I urge you to go to unity3d.com in order to check out their documentation on that. Okay, that's all the properties on the menu manager. The menu manager is probably the most complicated tool in the Adventure Toolkit, if only for the number of properties it has, but it is also the most powerful tool for your user. Okay, while you can hit play and work with menu managers on their own without doing anything else to them, you will not be able to hear, for example, the button press sound effects, and you will not be able to go to other scenes until you've hooked them up to, namely, the scene manager. And in this case also I would like to show off the options manager stuff. So I've turned those on. Let's go ahead and hit play. You can see our menu, we can see our title and our buttons. You can see the tooltips show up in the tooltip area as I hover over the buttons, and if we click on our toggleable buttons, you can hear the sound effects of the button press sound effects. And if I turn sound effects off, you do not hear them because that's part of the sound effects standard option. Okay, I would like to go to another scene, so I'll hit next scene, and you can tell that we have gone to another scene because I've stuck an object here saying this is a different scene. Conveniently, there is a scene trigger here, and by the way, we're going to go over all these scene tools in our scene folder tools examples coming next. But for now, I just want to head back to this scene. I want to show off how this arrow can turn blue with a custom option. So I'm going to hit this button arrow white, turn it to arrow blue. And because custom options happen on scene load, I'm going to go to the other scene and head us back to the original scene to see our arrow turn blue. Okay. Again, we'll go over scene tools in another example reel, but that is the menu manager, and that is all the tools in the interaction folder, and that is all the time we have for this video. Please stay tuned for the next one where we do go over tools from the scene folder.